Hey everybody, this is an entry from the anthology Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Haberkern and Lippau. E. Haberkern and Arthur Lippau. The way the book's organized, each has like chapters. The first chapter is titled The Revolution Betrayed. And it has two pieces. One from James Burnham, who at this time was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and then briefly being a member of the Shachtman's Workers' Party before breaking with Marxism entirely. The second piece is from a French Trotskyist named Ivan Kristol, who I'm not exactly sure of his entire trajectory, but he was someone who, obviously he's in this book, but he's obviously someone who kind of developed a independent bureaucratic collectivist conception of the USSR in France. So this video is just going to be From Formula to Reality by James Burnham, and not include the Fourth International and the Russian Counter-Revolution by Ivan Kristol. So I'm good, but the reason I'm saying any of this at all is because the book, the chapter, has a little introduction, and I'd like to read the introduction to the chapter, even though I'm going to be only reading one piece from this chapter, one article from this chapter. So I hope that made sense about why I'm said all that stuff. But anyway, Chapter 1, The Revolution Betrayed, 1936. In 1936, Leon Trotsky wrote a book whose English title was The Revolution Betrayed. His thesis was that the counter-revolution organized by Stalin had succeeded in destroying the last remnants of the socialist movement in Russia. All means of organization and self-expression on the part of the working class and the population as a whole had been destroyed by the new totalitarian state bureaucracy. The state, which was now the exclusive property of this new bureaucracy, was, through its program of collectivization, on the way to becoming the sole proprietor of the national economy. This state and this bureaucracy were not the successors to the workers' state created by the revolution, but its grave diggers. It was the enemy of the socialist movement, of the working class, and of progress. As we pointed out in the introduction, this was a, quote, new Trotskyism, end quote. Previously, Trotsky, like most other observers, had believed that the bureaucracy was feeling its way to an accommodation with capitalism. He held a, quote, three factions, end quote, theory. According to this theory, one faction whose spokesman was Bukharin was pandering to the acquisitive instincts of the small property-holding peasant and directly preparing the way for a capitalist restoration. A second faction, led by Trotsky supporters in Russia, was defending the egalitarian and socialist traditions of the revolution. And the third faction, epitomized by Stalin, was defending the bureaucracy's new privileged position in an opportunistic and pragmatic fashion. Since its privileges depended on collectivized property, the bureaucracy had to defend that property against attempts at restoration. On the other hand, as a privileged grouping, the bureaucracy also had to fight the egalitarian tendencies of its opponents on the left. Trotsky had initially believed that this bureaucratic faction would be ground between its two opponents and collapse, but he was proved wrong. Already by 1930, Trotsky was forced to admit that events were not proceeding according to his script. The bureaucracy was destroying what organized opposition existed on the left and simultaneously expropriating the peasantry and rapidly moving to centralize all economic power in the hands of the state. The picture left Trotsky without a theoretical explanation of what was happening. Logically, Trotsky should have concluded that the bureaucracy was a new class in the making. But this was not a conclusion Trotsky could accept. The contradiction between Trotsky's ever more bitter political hostility towards the regime and his belief that in defending a collectivist form of property, the regime was somehow advancing the cause of socialism created confusion and dissension in his movement. Particularly unsettling was Trotsky's obvious confusion over the new 1936 Constitution of the USSR. In it, Stalin announced sweeping reforms guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, and assembly and rejecting class warfare and, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat. But behind this facade aimed at Western public opinion, a mass campaign of terror and purges destroyed all opposition. In Trotsky's theory, this dismantling of the, quote, workers' state ideologically and physically should have signaled a turn towards capitalism. Despite the illusions of moderate socialists, liberals, and businessmen anxious to open up this new market, inside Russia what little remained of a free market or private property was wiped out. Eventually, the Trotskyist movement was destroyed by its inability to devise a theoretical basis for its increasingly bitter anti-Stalinism. In 1937, Trotsky began to prepare his followers for the founding of a new international organization that would be capable of leading the working class in the revolutionary crisis he believed imminent. In the discussions of the platform to be adopted by this new organization, the theoretical confusion of the movement became apparent. In both the American and French movements, opposition voices demanded a clear break with the old, quote, three factions, end quote, theory. Two of the most cogent of these first polemics against Trotsky's position are reprinted here. The second of the two, by Ivan Kristol, is reprinted from the report in the French Trotskyist journal. The editorial comments in this article are those of the editors of the journal. Okay. So like I said before, I am reading just James Burnham's piece for now, but I do plan on reading Ivan Kristol's piece as well. Quote, so From Formula to Reality by James Burnham. Quote, Doctrinaire will doubtless not be satisfied with this hypothetical definition. They would like categorical formula, yes, yes, and no, no. Sociological problems would certainly be simpler if social phenomenon had always a finished character. There is nothing more dangerous, however, than to throw out of reality for the sake of logical completeness elements which today violate your scheme and tomorrow may wholly overturn your scheme. In our analysis, we have above all avoided doing violence to dynamic social formations which have had no precedent and have no analogies. The scientific task, as well as the political, is not to give a finished definition to an unfinished project, but to follow all its stages, separate its progressive from its reactionary tendencies, expose their mutual relations, foresee possible variants of development, and find in this foresight a basis for action. Leon Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed. Some puzzling omissions, ... It is instructive to notice how much is omitted from the resolution of the committee majority around, Cannon and Aburn, on the Russian question. For example, nowhere does the resolution state flatly and unambiguously, quote, in the Soviet Union the proletariat is the ruling class, end quote. Nowhere does the resolution declare itself on the problem of the, quote, dual or, quote, single character of the bureaucracy. This problem cannot be dismissed as a trifle. All historical institutions, of course, have in a certain formal sense a, quote, dual role. Even the bourgeois state, even employers act occasionally, quote, by accident, in the interest of the proletariat. But for the purposes of action, in order to establish our policies and perspectives, we sum up the character of each institution taken as a whole, defining it as on the whole, quote, progressive or, quote, reactionary, or in certain unusual cases as, quote, dual. Thus we say that the bourgeoisie is in the present epoch reactionary, and we do not support the bourgeoisie. We say that the struggle of the loyalists against Franco, in spite of numerous reactionary features, if we were abstracting out separate elements, is on the whole, or rather taken as a whole, progressive, and we have supported it. In the first years of the Russian Revolution, we said that the regime was unambiguously progressive. Then for many years, we have said that it had a dual character, and we advocated defense of the Soviet Union and the revolution, but political struggle against the bureaucracy. Does the bureaucratic regime, does Stalinism, that is to say, today, preserve that dual character, taken as a whole, or has Stalinism lost that dual character and become, taken as a whole, reactionary? The resolution gives no answer. Nowhere does the resolution characterize unequivocally or even mention seriously the foreign policy of Stalinism, the social role of Stalinism, and Stalinism's institutions outside the boundaries of the Soviet Union. Nowhere does the resolution declare itself with reference to the possibility of the completion of the counter-revolution within the Soviet Union without a wide-scale mass civil war. We have observed before this that slogans and formulas divorced from specific content are meaningless. Merely repeating, quote, peace, bread, and land, end quote, did not make the French Stalinists Bolsheviks a few years ago. The committee majority is concerned for the formula, quote, workers' state. But the omissions reveal strikingly the lack of specific content which this formula possesses for the committee. Why these omissions? In the first place, behind the back of the formula there is concealed a complete lack of agreement among the supporters of the resolution. This came rapidly to the surface in the membership discussion. Comrades Cannon and Aburn declare that Stalinism has still a dual role. Comrades Weber and Schachtman, that it has now a single, i.e., reactionary, counter-revolutionary role. Sorry, I don't want to repeat that sentence. It's important, but I feel like I was spacing out while I was saying it. Comrades Cannon and Aburn declared that Stalinism has still a dual role. Comrades Weber and Schachtman that it has now a single, i.e., reactionary, counter-revolutionary role. Schachtman, Aburn, Cannon declare that Stalinism outside of foreign boundaries has exactly the same social role as internally. Weber, and now Comrade Trotsky, that externally, as in Spain, Stalinism has now a purely counter-revolutionary role and acts solely in the interests of the bourgeoisie, Comrade Trotsky making an explicit distinction between its role in Spain and its role internally. Aburn ruled out the possibility of a completion of the internal counter-revolution without a mass civil war. Weber admits that possibility. Schachtman and, so far as I can gather, Trotsky do not declare themselves explicitly. Certain supporters of the majority, i.e. Felix Morrow, these are all these names that I'm saying are just important figures within the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States. After it, I think this is all after the end of its flirtation with the trying to be an interest party in, I believe, the American Socialist Party. I'm not sure. There's like the French turn where in the United States where, like, you know, Trotsky is sort of supposed to be an integrated segment within the a larger Labor Party, but they abandoned that later into the 1930s. Anyway, I'm just saying that all these names are from that Party. Certain supporters of the majority, i.e. Felix Morrow, say that the conception of a, quote, ruling class has nothing to do with the conception of a, quote, state. Others say that a, quote, workers' state means one in which the proletariat is the ruling class. In the second place, these omissions serve to give the resolution a false character in the eyes of the membership. The resolution professes to declare that something, quote, new has occurred within the Soviet Union during the past 2 or 3 years, and that we must therefore make a new analysis, or rather extend our previous analysis to cover the new phenomenon. This profession is even more urgently made in Shachtman's article in the New International. But in reality, the retention of the formula, quote, workers' state prevents any extension to cover the undoubtedly new phenomenon, and results, if consistently carried through, in simply a restatement of our old analysis, bracket, the, quote, three factions, end quote, analysis. E. Haberkern, that's from the editor, end quote, end bracket, with no change whatever. This is recognized by Comrade Victor Fox. His statement in Bulletin Number 2 is a careful and exact formulation of what follows from the retention of the formula, quote, workers' state. The committee majority insists that it does not accept Fox's statement, but in the discussion they have not pointed out a single reason for not accepting it, and they have made absolutely no criticism of it, save for one passing literary criticism of a single phrase made by James P. Cannon. Thus, the resolution is demagogic. The resolution pretends to be what the resolution is not, and recommends itself to the membership under false colors. Let Victor Fox demand from the committee majority an explanation of their rejection of his statement. So far, the committee majority have given none. If the committee majority cannot give a political motivation, the committee majority's rejection must be understood as merely bureaucratic, or at best stylistic, and the committee majority cannot give a political motivation. Thirdly, the omissions must be understood as hiding the contradictions within the position of the committee majority and the inadequacy of the committee majority's formulas for handling the present reality. These contradictions I shall develop more at length in what follows. And disturbing contradictions. I've already cited certain of the contradictions among supporters of the resolution on key specific problems. There are, however, other contradictions not only among various interpretations, but inherent to the position itself. For example, it is contended by Aburn and Sterling that we give unconditional support to the Soviet Union and to the Red Army under any and all circumstances, and Cannon has also expressed agreement with this view. So long as we believe that the Soviet Union is a workers' state, this view is altogether plausible. If it is a workers' state, the possibility of its engaging in a reactionary war is not realistic and does not have to be taken into account. But the past year and a half have made clear that there is a very real possibility that the Soviet Union and the Red Army may engage in a reactionary war, for example, as part of a, quote, League Army to liquidate the Spanish Civil War, or in China. Indeed, this possibility was nearly realized and may yet be. In such a war, do we defend and support the Red Army? Cannon, Aburn, and Sterling have said yes. But I do not believe Cannon, Aburn, and Sterling have thought the problem out. Of course, we do not support them under such circumstances. To do so would be to support the counter-revolution. Shachtman understands this and recognizes such a possibility, though rightly pointing out that it is less probable than an imperialist attack on the Soviet Union. However, Shachtman's understanding and recognition are incompatible with his alleged view that the Soviet Union remains a workers' state. Shachtman's inconsistency in this instance enables Shachtman to draw a correct political conclusion. Cannon, Aburn, and Sterling are consistent and wrong. If the Soviet Union is still a workers' state, the possibility of the restoration of private property without a mass civil war is excluded. at least if we still retain our traditional view on the nature of revolutions. During the last several years, however, our movement has widely recognized that the restoration might be accomplished without mass civil war, though not without a certain amount of violence. Indeed, there has been plenty of violence during this period, and it is clear on the surface of events that it might be. But this recognition is in reality a recognition that the Soviet Union is no longer a workers' state. The state, that is, the organs and institutions of coercion in society, the army, police, GPU, courts, prisons, bureaucracy, and even the juridical basis of the state, as provided in the new constitution, the de jure locus of sovereignty in the new parliaments, does not have to be overthrown in order to accomplish the full social and economic counter-revolution. It does not have to be, though in point of fact it might be, dependent upon the specific developments. On the other hand, it is by now clear that getting rid of Stalinism, that we call, quote, the political revolution, end quote, what is in truth the reestablishment of the class rule of the proletariat, does in all probability require not the mere, quote, reform of the bureaucracy, not simply a, quote, change of government, but the overthrow of the present state and its organs and institutions, the abolition of the bureaucracy, the creation of a new, quote, army of the people, the destruction of the GPU, the abolition of the new constitution and its juridical provisions. The, quote, political revolution, end quote, will create a dual power counter to the present state power, perhaps under the slogan of, quote, all power back to the Soviets, end quote, and will achieve victory through the transfer of power. What does all this mean? What can it mean of the political revolution which we advocate, except that this political revolution involves a change in class rule, not merely a change in the form of rule by the same class, which is what we advocated up to a few years ago. If the Soviet Union is still a worker state, if that is to say, the working class is still the ruling class within the Soviet Union, then our policies, the program we advocate for the Soviet Union, is entirely unjustifiable. And we must return to our policies and programs of 4 or 5 years ago. Here again, comrade, what the hell is his name? First name. Anyway, comrade, isn't it Victor? Victor Fox? It says Fox, sorry, Here again, comrade Victor Fox's statement is enlightening, for Victor Fox is consistent. It is altogether clear from a careful reading of his statement that he cannot really accept our present policy of, quote, political revolution. The contradictions are even more glaring in connection with the question of the social role of Stalinism outside of the Soviet Union. It is, I have always understood, an elementary tenet of Marxism that the social role of a class or a state is basically the same nationally and internationally. There may be, of course, accidental or temporary deviations from this rule, but in crises and over any considerable period of time, it emerges clearly. For many years, we have criticized the Lovestonites on exactly this point. We have said that their distinction between the internal role of the Stalinist bureaucracy, beneficial and praiseworthy, and its external role, reactionary and disruptive, is not only a direct violation of Marxism, but makes it altogether impossible to explain either Stalinism or the Soviet Union, or to hold a correct policy with reference to them. I found rather startling the casual and as if incidental manner in which Comrade Trotsky brushed aside this doctrine and his method of analysis. After explaining the internal role of the bureaucracy as dual, and as in one aspect genuinely defending the interest of the proletariat, and after insisting that within the Soviet Union the proletariat is still the ruling class and the state a worker state, Trotsky suddenly writes, quote, "The same Stalin in Spain, i.e. on the soil of a bourgeois regime, executes the function of Hitler," end quote. which function he had just defined as defending the bourgeois forms of property. If the thesis itself is startling, involving the conception that Stalinism in Spain has a completely different social role, expresses completely different class interests from Stalinism within the Soviet Union, the suggested explanation nowhere any further developed is even more so, quote, i.e., on the soil of a bourgeois regime, ... end quote. But Stalinism, even Stalinism in Spain, is surely not a, quote, Spanish phenomenon. Stalinism in Spain, as in the Soviet Union and in every other country, springs, we have always taught, from the soil of the Soviet Union, where, among other features, nationalized property relations and the monopoly of foreign trade still obtain. It is because these property relations do not any longer constitute the Soviet Union a worker state, because they accompany a state which is not a worker state, because the proletariat is not any longer the ruling class within the Soviet Union, that Stalinism is able to and does play its current role in Spain. No other consistent explanation can be given for Stalinism in Spain. To say that the bureaucracy within the Soviet Union expresses, even if in a distorted manner, the interest of the proletariat, but in Spain only and unequivocally the interest of the bourgeoisie, is, if carried to a conclusion, to deny the class analysis of social phenomenon. You cannot have it both ways. The fundamental class role of Stalinism must be understood as identical in Spain and in the Soviet Union, whatever modifications we may have to make in the form it takes as conditioned by the particular and local conditions. Again, Schachtman, in his New International article, states and repeats, always in italics, quote, "The victory of the Stalinist bureaucracy marks the victory of a political counter-revolution," end quote. The majority spokesmen, including Comrade Trotsky, grant us that the state is a, quote, political category. What then can the definite victory of a political counter-revolution, and we entirely agree that this has taken place, signify? Is Schachtman just playing with words? It can only mean, is it not sufficiently obvious, that the class which once held the state power, the political power, it is not a question here of the, quote, forms of government, end quote, which is quite a different matter. Political power need not shift with a change in the form of government, no longer holds it. The working class no longer holds state power. As applied to the Soviet Union, that the working class which once ruled, even if in a distorted manner, no longer rules. Schachtman directly refutes himself. Light is thrown upon Schachtman's contention, not at all shared by all supporters of the resolution, by recalling a discussion in the National Committee during the time of the formulation of the resolution. In a long and in fact impassioned speech, Schachtman defended the thesis that what was new in the present situation in the Soviet Union was that, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat has been overthrown, liquidated, 100% destroyed, but that the worker state, in the sense of the nationalized production, remained, end quote. Schachtman explained that, quote, that by, quote, worker state, Schachtman meant merely nationalized production. However awkward this formulation, it was a commendable attempt to expand and dissociate old formulas in such a manner as to make them more suitable for handling present realities. But chastening remarks from Cannon, Aborn, and others, who in points of fact do not really agree, not simply with Schachtman's formulations, but with Schachtman's views, persuaded Schachtman to withdraw into his present self-contradictory position. 1 second. The argument of the majority in the Copernican circles. What is the argument of the committee majority reduced to its simplest and essential form? We ask them, what kind of state is the Soviet Union? They answer, it is a worker state. We ask, why is it a worker state? They answer, because there is nationalized property. And we ask, why does nationalized property make it a worker state? And they answer, because a worker state is one where there is nationalized property. This is, in form, exactly the same argument used by those who tell us that the Bible is the Word of God. We ask them, how do you know it is the Word of God? They answer, because the Bible itself says it is the Word of God. We ask, but how does that prove it to be true? And they answer, because nothing that God said could be a lie. In both instances, the conclusion has been taken for granted in the premises. The argument is entirely circular and can prove nothing whatever. At best, it is a definition that the majority offers us, but it gives no proof that this definition is of the slightest use as a tool in solving our theoretical and practical problems. The point in dispute is just that point which the majority takes for granted without proof or argument or evidence. The point is it a fact that nationalized production of and by itself makes a state a workers' state, guarantees the class rule of the workers, assures the transition to socialism? The point in dispute is not at all whether nationalized production is a necessary aspect of a worker state, which, except for temporary exceptions, no one in the least argues, merely whether it is also a sufficient aspect. Now that the last 20 years, in particular the last 2 or 3 years, have taught us, now what the last 20 years, in particular the last 2 or 3 years, have taught us, if we wish to be taught, is exactly that nationalized production of and by itself does not make a workers' state, does not guarantee the class rule of the workers, does not assure the transition to socialism. For these things there is a political as well as a socio-economic precondition. If this conclusion disturbs us, if it seems to disagree with our earlier expectations and predictions, then we must revise, readapt, or extend these expectations and predictions, and not try to escape facts by explaining them away. Naturalists once proved that all swans are white, but black swans were nevertheless discovered in New Zealand. When Copernicus revolutionized Ptolemaic astronomy by postulating the sun instead of the earth as the fixed reference point for astronomical calculation, he still retained the older theory that the planets had circular orbits. This was thought to follow from the perfection of God, who would never have been the cause of any motion but perfect motion, which was held to be motion in a circle. On this theory, Copernicus was able to explain all of the observed phenomenon, but he did so only at the cost of a most cumbersome and awkward mathematical process. Kepler showed the postulated elliptical motions of the planetary orbits, made the mathematics enormously simpler, and besides suggested new and fruitful hypotheses for explaining additional phenomenon and make additional predictions. Of course, Kepler also explained that God's perfection could quite consistently express itself in an ellipse. The majority clings to its circle, its definition, and any definition can, if stretched willfully enough, serve, but when it goes beyond a certain point, it becomes so cumbersome, so out of accord with what men ordinarily understand by language, that instead of being an instrument for the communication of truths and the illumination of events, it acts to obscure and confuse us and others. And this is just what has happened in the definition of the Soviet Union as a, quote, workers' state, end quote. For by now it is little more any longer than a question of a definition. This definition is now an instrument for hiding reality, for confusing meanings, for obscuring events, and it is time to drop it. Quote, proletarian economy, the majority discovers a theoretical topsy. In addition to defend in attempting to defend their view by argument, an altogether fruitless attempt, since the only argument, is the purely circular one just discussed, the spokesman of the majority have discovered that there is a, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, comparable to feudal, bourgeois, and socialist economy, like Topsy. This concept must have, quote, just grown, end quote, for there is no slightest indication of its parentage in events, Marxism, or in science generally. In the Soviet Union, they tell us, there is a, quote, proletarian economy, and since the state, quote, expresses the economy, it is therefore a proletarian or workers' state. If this doctrine becomes publicly known, it will certainly be an unusual surprise for the Stalinist theoreticians. For many years, we told them that they couldn't build socialism in a single country, even maintain a workers' regime indefinitely in a single country, for the precise reason that there is no proletarian economy or society or culture. There is simply an intermediary transitional economy, society, and culture, but administered in the direction of socialism by the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the political rule of the working class, as Marx himself explained it. It would be no less surprising to Marx, who devoted his entire life and almost all of his major theoretical work, the book Capital itself, to proving that there could not be a proletarian economy, but that bourgeois economy would be and would have to be replaced by a socialist economy. It is true that all workers' states will take certain similar economic measures. For example, the expropriation of the bourgeoisie in one after another of the realms of the economy, or of all of them at once, and the nationalization of these realms in order to assure the continuance of proletarian domination and the transition to socialism. But it is absolutely false that this constitutes a distinctive economy, which involves distinctive property rights held by the members of a distinctive class. This is just what distinguishes the rule of the proletariat from the rule of all other classes in history. The proletariat takes power not to establish a new economic regime, a new system of property rights, or for itself as a class, but by progressive steps starting with the expropriation and nationalization of the key productive industries to do away with property rights altogether. There is no distinctive, quote, proletarian property right. If there is, Marxism in its entirety, in its theory and its politics, is completely wrong. This has an enormous importance in our understanding of the nature of the state. The state is not identical with the economy. To think so, as do some of the spokesmen of the majority, is the most vulgar sort of monism. If it were, there would be no need for a theory of the state, since the theory of the economy would in advance have covered the theory of the state. But the theory of the state is probably the key theory of Marxism, and reformism has almost always developed by keeping hold of Marxian economics, sometimes in very orthodox form, but denying the related but not identical theory of the state. Within any social system, the, quote, state refers to organs and institutions of social and political coercion, the army, police, courts, prisons, bureaucracy. The theory of the state asserts that these organs and institutions will, on the whole and in general, be used as instruments to aid the interest of those who occupy the dominating social position in terms of the economy of property rights. The proof of this theory is not a matter of definition, but of evidence, namely to show how this actually happens in various social systems. Gorin's brilliant book on fascism, for example, abounds with concrete evidence showing how fascist states in Germany and Italy do in point of fact uphold the interest of those who occupy the dominating social positions in terms of the economy, namely the bourgeoisie, showing among other things the superficiality of the view that fascism involves the, quote, political expropriation, end quote, of the bourgeoisie. In a feudal society, the property relations serve the interest of those who have the chief property rights, namely the feudal lords. The organs of the state, in considerable part manned by the feudal lords themselves, so long as they defend those property relations, whatever form the state organs take, thus do actually serve as the instrument of the feudal lords as a class, do defend their interest and their domination. The interest and domination of the bourgeoisie in society is assured whenever the members of the bourgeoisie hold in their persons, directly or indirectly, the decisive property rights in the instruments of production. The state can take many forms: monarchy, parliamentary democracy, personal dictatorship, fascism, and be peopled governmentally by various strata of society. But while it defends and protects bourgeois property rights, it is by that act defending and protecting those who hold the rights, since those rights are what serve the interests of the ones who hold them, are what assures their general social rule and domination as a class. This follows not because of any mystical identification of the state with the economy, nor is the state defending a mere abstraction, a quote, system of property relations, end quote. The state defends the interest of a given group of persons, a given class rule and domination, and the concrete property rights are merely the method by which those interests and that class rule are assured. We prove this not by definition, but by examining the facts, and up to the present the facts, even in the case of fascism, bear out our predictions and analyses. There is no direct analogy in the proletarian dictatorship. Under capitalism, the proletariat has no property rights in the instruments of production. Neither does the proletariat have such rights under the dictatorship of the proletariat. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, it is the state, not the workers, which has the property rights. Therefore, the supreme question becomes, whose state is it? Whose interest does the state express? For whom and against whom does it function? The bourgeoisie, so long as its property rights are intact, is guaranteed class domination. Not so the proletariat, for the proletariat has no property rights. It can assert its class domination only through the state, and therefore, if it loses the state, if the state no longer expresses the proletariat's interests, if the state functions primarily against the proletariat and not against the class enemy, this means that its class domination has been destroyed. And this is just what has happened in the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, for many years, the state was undermining the class domination of the workers. It was, as we said, a degenerated worker state. Within the last 2 or 3 years, it has completed that divorce from the proletariat, and consequently the state is no longer a worker state. 20 years ago, perhaps, we would have thought this impossible without the prior destruction of the nationalized economy. History teaches us, it shows us that the class rule of the proletariat can indeed take a number of forms. Free Soviets, many parties, one party, bureaucratic distortion, bureaucratic dictatorship, and perhaps others we do not yet know. But it shows us also that the nationalized economy can remain and the rule of the workers be destroyed. How else possibly can we describe and explain what has happened? The doctrine of a, quote, proletarian economy leads, if carried out to that doctrine's conclusion, to many ludicrous conclusions. Comrade Trotsky nowhere states this doctrine, but Trotsky also in the present article, though not at all in previous years when he defined the significance of the term, quote, workers' state, end quote, in quite a different manner, treats the nationalized economy as the sole and sufficient criterion of a workers' state. He makes nationalized economy equal to and identical in meaning with, quote, workers' state, and this is in substance the doctrine of a, quote, proletarian economy. But Trotsky must at once modify his own doctrine. The workers' state existed from November 1917 on, though the economy was not nationalized until later. How then did you know at the time, not looking backward after the economy had been nationalized, that it was a workers' state? Obviously, you knew not by an economic criterion, which you here advance as the only and sufficient criterion, but by a social and more particularly a political criterion. The workers had the power. But let us grant the brief, quote, exceptional, end quote, period, and charge it to the lags of history. But we suddenly find, quote, should a bourgeois counter-revolution succeed in Russia, the new government for a lengthy period would have to base itself upon nationalized economy, end quote. My emphasis. What has become of our sole and sufficient criterion for judging the nature of a state? Why should not this new government be a, quote, be a worker state? Such a government conforms absolutely to the definition of a workers' state given by Trotsky himself. How is this to be reconciled with the statement a few pages later, quote, however, so long as that contradiction has not passed from the sphere of distribution to the sphere of production, and has not blasted nationalized property and planned economy, the state remains a workers' state, end quote. In truth, they cannot be reconciled. Trotsky, however, violating his logic, attempts a reconciliation to explain how a bourgeois counter-revolution could rule on the basis of nationalized economy. Quote, but what does not such a type of temporary conflict between economy and state mean? It means a revolution or a counter-revolution, ... end quote. But how during the, quote, lengthy period, end quote, when the nationalized economy still endures, do you know that a revolution or a counter-revolution has taken place? Only by a change in the economy which has not taken place according to your own criterion. But here we are once again in a circle. Do you not know not by what has already happened? Do you know not by what has already happened, but by what the new state prepares to do, intends to do? That is what the new state's direction and perspective is. But the present bureaucracy prepares the economic change very clearly, quote, intends to consolidate a new class position, to destroy the nationalized economy, that is, its direction and perspective. How then does it differ from the bourgeois counter-revolution in its early stages? The logic of the committee majority's position leads to a still more unacceptable conclusion. If it is true that the nationalized economy is the sole and sufficient criterion of a worker state, it then follows that the strength, extension, and progress of nationalized economy is the sole and sufficient criterion for the strength, extension, and progress of the worker state. This is like actually, it seems like it might say what I'm about to say in the next line, so hold on. This was the view of many Marxists, even members of the left opposition at the time of the announcement of the first 5-year plan. Reasoning from this premise, they considered it, quote, inevitable, end quote, that the success, even the partial success of the plan would automatically strengthen, extend, and make for the progress of the worker state. That is, the form of society transitional between capitalism and socialism, but in point of fact greatly weakened and further degenerated during the period of the plan, in spite of the greater extension and expansion of the nationalized economy. This result cannot be explained on the basis of an acceptance of nationalized as a sole. This result cannot be explained on the basis of an acceptance of nationalization as a sole and sufficient criterion or condition of a worker state. Such a basis can support only the Stalinist conclusion, not ours. To my understanding, one of the cores of the bureaucratic collectivism thesis is that Stalinism is concurrently anti-proletarian, anti-working class, and anti-bourgeois at the same time, which is distinct from, a state capitalist thesis who thinks that, it might have been, Stalinism might have been anti-bourgeois insofar as it expropriated, what you might call bourgeois elements or within the Soviet Union, but merely replaced them with its own state-administered form of capitalism. So it might be like anti-bourgeois, but still capitalist. I don't know, at least that's my understanding. These consequences of the position of the committee majority constitute a reductio ad absurdum of that position. The only way to avoid them, as well as to rid our position on the Soviet state from its internal contradictions and its utter inadequacy in explaining events, is to abandon that position. This means, first of all, to recognize that nationalized economy is not a sole and sufficient criterion or condition of a worker state, to understand that other factors must be taken into account. It means that we do not settle the question of the nature of the Soviet state by appeal to, quote, definition, but examine concretely not merely the economic foundation, but the actual relation of the state apparatus to that economy, its actual relation to the working class, the actual position of the working class in the Soviet regime. Such an examination of evidence, not of definition, can lead only to the conclusion that within the Soviet Union the working class is not the ruling or dominant class, and that therefore the Soviet Union is not a workers' state. Why defend the Soviet Union? The most important... That's a heading. The most frequently used argument of the committee majority against the minority has been that our position, if logically carried out, leads to the advocacy of defeatist policies and undermines the theoretical basis for the defensist policy which we jointly claim to uphold. It should be observed that this argument is not of the slightest weight with reference to the question at issue. The great English philosopher David Hume once remarked, quote, "There is no method of reasoning more common and yet none more blamable than in philosophical disputes to endeavor the refutation of any hypothesis by a pretense of its dangerous consequences to religion and morality. When any opinion leads to absurdities, it is certainly false, but it is not certain that an opinion is false because it is of dangerous consequence." End quote. If a correct analysis of the nature of the Soviet state leads us to defeatism, then we must change our policies, not our analysis. Nevertheless, the analysis of the minority does not lead to defeatism. Why should we be for the defense of the Soviet Union? ? If we are defeatist, our position has nothing to do with whether or not we call the Soviet Union a, quote, workers' state. Only a medicine man would base a policy on what things are called. We are defensists because we estimate that, in the light of the actual situation in the Soviet Union, the actual development there, such a policy is in the interest of the proletariat and of the world revolution. We are for defense primarily because we, both of the committee majority and of the committee minority, consider that the socio-economic relations still obtaining in the Soviet Union are progressive and are worth defending. They are progressive for four major reasons. Their origin is in the October Revolution, the first successful proletarian revolution. This is by no means a trivial point. A wage rise won by a successful strike is more progressive than a rise of the same amount handed down by the bosses to head of a strike. To head off a strike. Sorry. It says of, but I think it's supposed to be off. The traditions and ideals of the revolution still carried, though forced far below the surface, in the hearts and minds of the Russian masses are bound up with the socio-economic relations. These relations provide the indispensable foundation of the workers' state. That is, once the workers' state is re-established, once the workers again make themselves the ruling class by ousting usurpers, they will be in a position to go forward decisively towards socialism without being forced to undertake a complete social and economic revolution. This is the precise focus of our positive policy, to re-establish the class rule of the workers. There is no other way to explain the meaning of the policies which we actually do advocate. Most decisive of all in showing the necessity for a defensive policy is to compare the possible alternatives from the point of view of the workers' revolution. And this, in general, is how we decide whether we are for or against a policy. If the Soviet Union is defeated by an imperialist power, it will revert to the position of a semi-colonial nation, perhaps partly partitioned off in Frank colonies. And the world revolution will be set back enormously. In the struggle against imperialism, the Soviet masses will have a genuine chance not merely to defeat the imperialist power, by itself progressive, but in the course of the struggle to cast off their back the usurpers, regain class rule, and go triumphantly forward. It seems important to note, just from a side note, that if you listen to like Donald Filtzer's and Wendy Z. Goldman's work about the Soviet home front during World War II, this is precisely what did not happen. There was never according to Donald Filtzer, there was never greater support for the regime of the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, than during the World War II. What defensism ultimately culminated in was Russian patriotism. The great the Great Fatherland War. It did not result in a democratization of the Soviet Union. It did not result in workers having more power. It did not result in the bureaucracy being overthrown. These kind of predictions that are being made about the results of Russian defensism in the World War II did not come to fruition. That's not to say that, it's always a weird thing. It's always a weird thing to me, like defense of the Soviet Union. It's like a weird thing because it's like, even within like the bourgeois, even like the bourgeois state, like I'm against France being conquered by Germany, regardless of any features that are negative about either of those countries, for instance. It seems like it's just like like I'm not pro-Ukraine in the sense of being like a thumbs up to anything that happens in Ukraine, but that doesn't mean I'm like pro it being invaded. I think you can be. I think in this position, it seems to me at least. I mean, maybe this is just this is not based upon like pragmatic like, okay, what does this mean for like the revolution, whatever? Which I think those arguments are usually kind of flimsy, and oftentimes their predictions are incorrect. As these predictions that I'm pausing here for were incorrect. But I think for just like the human cost of what an invasion of any country entails, that should be the reason for we should oppose. I feel like it's what makes sense is like oppose aggressive actions by states on other states, because those aggressive actions aren't just against other states; they're against the people of those states, and that's what should be considered. I mean, the opposition, for instance, to like the Iraq War, I think the sensible opposition to that war is the human cost that it would inflict upon the local population, not whether Saddam Hussein's country represents something progressive in comparison to like the United States, which it absolutely did not. That seems like that's the reason for opposing war, and the same thing I think could be said about Vietnam. Like I have no doubt in my mind about the Stalinist reactionary nature of the Viet Cong, for instance, but I'm opposed for what a war in that country led by the United States against peasant guerrillas or peasant soldiers or whatever, and I'm opposed to that for humanitarian reasons. I'm opposed to that for anti-authoritarian reasons. I'm opposed to that for like what you might call like humanistic reasons. I don't have to like have this kind of thing where I defend any particular state in order to say, no, it should not be invaded. That seems so. Like the defense of the Soviet Union, and it's like the Soviet Union wants to kill all these people who are calling to defense of it. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people in bureaucratic collectivist tradition, completely, that's one of the political consequences of their project, and why they're cease to stand by the defense of the USSR, because if the USSR was successful in any given battle in any given country, if the Stalinists came to power, say in the United States or whatever, it wouldn't mean good things for James P. Cannon or Max Shachtman. And it wouldn't mean anything good for working class democracy. So it's a weird thing to defensives. It doesn't seem like, if you're either defend the Soviet Union, or you believe that it should be made, a fucking a backward colony of the dominant Western powers. Those seem like two bullshit alternatives to one another. I think you can just say, invasions, wars are bad for the population, and they encourage nationalism and chauvinism at home, and only if they're cause a lot of. It seems like there's no necessary correlation between the wars and defection at home. In terms of I don't think that. I think what the ultimate consequences of a lot of wars is increased nationalism. Obviously, there will be people who resist that, but at least in the Soviet Union, it fucking built the cult of Stalin. It was the defensism of the Soviet Union against invasion from the West. If there's any, it built on and elaborated and thickened the power of the bureaucracy over the working population, not vice versa. Anyway, the consideration of the alternatives leaves no doubt whether that a The consideration of the alternatives leaves no doubt whatever that a defensive policy is mandatory. And this consideration of the alternatives leaves no doubt that a defensive policy is mandatory. And this consideration alone suffices to refute all varieties of defeatists. However, there is an ambiguity in the notion of, quote, unconditional defense of the Soviet Union. Events now make it necessary to point out certain distinctions which were formerly irrelevant. In reality, we stand for, quote, unconditional defense of the revolution, end quote. And this imposes certain conditions on our defense of the Soviet Union. The first condition is the struggle against Stalinism, without which, in our opinion, revolutionary defense of the Soviet Union is impossible. Secondly, we must now recognize the possibility that the Soviet Union may engage in a reactionary war. I've already mentioned how this might come about in connection with such events as those in Spain or China. In such cases, far from being for support or defense, we are for unconditional opposition to such a war. It is only when the war is itself progressive, e.g. is against imperialism, that we are for defense, and in those conditions we are for unconditional defense. Not all the supporters of the committee majority will agree with these views on the problem of defense. Aborn and Cannon, for example, have declared that any struggle in which the Red Army might be engaged would be, since it is the army of the workers' state, a progressive struggle and therefore must be supported. They are, in my opinion, entirely consistent in their reasoning, and this is only another example of why the entire position is false. Well then, what kind of state? In the first place, we cannot decide this question, as I have already shown, by identifying the state with the economy. In that case, the whole theory of the state becomes meaningless. Even Comrade Trotsky is guilty here. After agreeing that the, quote, state is a, quote, political category, Trotsky slips into the identification by repeating an aphorism, quote, however, this very politics is only concentrated economics, end quote. This aphorism, however illuminating when considered as a metaphor, is a most questionable step in an argument. We must decide what kind of state it is by analyzing the relationship of the political institutions, army, bureaucracy, GPU, courts, prisons, that is the state itself, to the economy and to the classes and social groups within the Soviet Union and internationally. By such an analysis, we are trying to describe a very complicated set of events which are in process of rapid change. Our description will, on that account, be at least partially inadequate and distorting, since it will suggest more finality than is to be found in the changing process itself. But it can be reasonably accurate. In such a description, the committee minority can, it believes, come to virtual agreement with some of the supporters of the position of the committee majority. From many points of view, it would be well to stop with such a description, and to forbear at this time the attempt to sum the description up in a single formula, which in the light of the rapidity of change now going on is doomed to be misleading to one or another degree. This description is altogether adequate as a guide to action and for further understanding, and nothing further is really needed. To stop with the generalized description and to refuse to be tied down to scholastic formulas. That is how I understand the quotation from The Revolution Betrayed with which I began this article. Our description will show us, in my opinion, beyond any doubt, that the Soviet Union is at the present time neither a bourgeois state nor a worker state. That is, neither the working class nor a consolidated bourgeois class is the ruling or dominant class within the Soviet Union, in any intelligible sense that can be given to the concept of a ruling or dominant class. Not a single piece of evidence to the contrary has been advanced in the current discussion. This may surprise us and may upset previously formed ideas, but history has a way of surprising us, and we must avoid acting like political ostriches. I don't know what the ostriches are like, but I'm assuming that's not a good thing. Well, I'm assuming it's reference to being taken by surprise, or ostriches are often taken by surprise. However, there is in general nothing unprecedented in such a conclusion. The cry of, quote, revisionism raised against us has no foundation in Marxist theory. Nothing whatever in the theory of the state limits types of states to, quote, bourgeois or, quote, proletarian. For many years, Lenin anticipated a state in Russia which would be a, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote. Lenin may have been wrong, but no one attacked Lenin as a revisionist for this conception of the state which was neither bourgeois nor proletarian. If Lenin was wrong because things didn't turn out in that way, not because such a state is theoretically inconceivable, not merely the possibility, but the historical existence, which were neither bourgeois nor feudal, not merely the possibility, but the historical existence of states which were neither bourgeois nor feudal nor proletarian were frequently discussed by Marx and Engels. Engels definitely provided a place for a state which was in direct conflict with the economy. That is, for a state in which the ruling class was not the economically dominant class. How much more obviously Engels would have recognized this possibility in the case of nationalized economy, which is not a form of economy giving property rights specifically to one class! Exclamation point. Cf., for example, his letter to Conrad Schmidt. Engels' letter to Conrad Schmidt. Of course, such a state would be extremely unstable and would not endure for long. Quote, in bracket this end bracket case, nowadays the state power in every great nation will go to pieces in the long run, end quote. But no one pretends that the present type of state in the Soviet Union will endure for epochs. It is above all characterized as unstable, transitory, impermanent crisis. The specific analysis of various states, an analysis exact enough to enable us to work out correct policies, absolutely requires us to recognize, quote, intermediary, end quote, forms of state. It would be fatal to limit our, quote, states to feudal, bourgeois, and proletarian. How could we possibly handle the analysis, for example, of the English state from 1500 to 1832 with only these simple categories? Of course, looking back, we can see that during all that time, the bourgeoisie by and large advanced along with the advance and expansion of bourgeois economy, but such a general and, after all, abstract view would have been of little use to the bourgeoisie in solving the complex problems of state power. And what was the U.S. Civil War fought over if not to destroy a coalition state? Not a coalition government. The form of government was not changed. Established under the Constitution of 1787, and replace it by an unambiguous bourgeois state. If I were forced to choose between the single alternative, bourgeois or proletarian, I should unhesitatingly call the Soviet state bourgeois. At the present time, the interests the Soviet state primarily defends are bourgeois. The bourgeois interests within the mixed Soviet economy and international bourgeois interests. The Soviet state's defense of proletarian interests, unlike its function up until a few years ago, is now clearly secondary. Although the Soviet state may on occasion be Let me repeat that. At the present time, the interest it primarily defends are bourgeois. The bourgeois interests within the mixed Soviet economy and international bourgeois interests. Its defense of proletarian interests, unlike its function up until a few years ago, is now clearly secondary, though it may on occasion be nonetheless real for all that, but there is no reason whatever to make such a choice. Is a single formula required? Very well, let all of us who agree on the description unite to agree on the clearest and most acceptable formula. In future history, I think Comrade Carter, referring to Joseph Carter, is probably right in saying that it will be known as a, quote, Stalinist state, end quote, distinguished as a specific state form, and there may be other examples of such a state in the future. If we look at the facts and not at words, the most accurate formula is probably a, quote, semi-bourgeois state, or a, quote, embryonic bourgeois state, end quote. The Soviet state at present is primarily the instrument of the privileged strata of Soviet society, the bureaucracy army, particularly the upper ranks, the GPU, the richer collective peasants, the technicians, intellectuals, better paid Stakhanovites, etc., and the instrument also of the sections of the international bourgeoisie toward which the state gravitates. Is this not the fact? Is this a, quote, no class, end quote, state? Of course not. It is simply not, primarily, the instrument of either of the two major classes in contemporary society, but it is the instrument of the, quote, new middle class, end quote, striving to become a consolidated bourgeois class within the Soviet Union itself. And it plays its own extremely important role in the international class struggle taken as a whole. What was I going to say? To my understanding of the Soviet Union, people, some historians, I believe, have referred to it as, in this period of like the 5-year plans under Stalin and World War II, as a affirmative action state in which, along with industrialization, of course, what is necessary is like a a class of people within that society who have technical know-how and management skills and all of the things that kind of go along with the extension of sophisticated means of production. So, for example, like if you imagine, say, Google, for instance, without a whole stratum of different kinds of specialists, for instance. With the development of industry in the Soviet Union in the 20s, late 20s, and early and on until Stalin's death, one of the things that was done was the recruitment of people from all different stratas of society, including societies that were previous bodies of people that were previously excluded from social advancement under Tsarism, coming into new positions, new educated positions of education that required education and training, and positions that situated them in a more or less more comfortable position within an overall stratified society. Still, like Donald Filter calls it, no matter how you fill in the, just because you make the pyramid more open doesn't keep the pyramid from being a pyramid. So there's obviously, I think the rates of inequality at this time are pretty severe, and I think that I think when he's saying that the state is an instrument of the quote new middle class, this is a kind of an early statement, but I think this is really I think this has actually panned out by history, is that I think one of the strongest bases of support for the Soviet state was this kind of like class of people who saw like pretty substantial social advancement within this time due to industrialization. So people who were like peasants or working class people or whatever, who had some kind of aptitude or opportunity to participate in the Soviet education system and get positions within the overall hierarchy of the economy. I think these people were pretty much were kind of probably the most popular base of support for. I would wager. I mean, can't be. This might be exaggeration, but I think I'm pretty sure that it was the case that like these are like the most popular, the people who most popularly supported the Soviet regime, were these people whose lives were like benefited by this kind of affirmative action system. And so him saying right here, the state is the instrument of the quote new middle class, end quote, striving to become a consolidated bourgeois class within the Soviet Union itself. I think there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, I believe that some people call like high Stalinism, which I believe is a reference to like Stalinism after World War II, in that period, as middle class Stalinism in the historiography. I think that also what was I going to say? I had some other thought here. Yeah, this class, whereas there's kind of a degree of this kind of social mobility, this kind of like affirmative action state that I'm talking about, that is kind of open to like all sorts, becomes closed as Soviet history progresses. So, for instance, like people who acquire positions of privilege within the Soviet hierarchy in the past, maybe not at first, but by like the late 1950s or like the 1950s and 1960s, are definitely passing on their own privileges to their children. Not in the form of like private property, like they're not handing down like factories and estates down to them, but they're handing handing down the kind of privileges and access to goods and education and things of that sort to their children. Interestingly enough, I think a large portion of these people who are like kind of this new middle class start to become a lot of them become kind of countercultural. like to the degree that there's like a kind of like a hippie movement in the Soviet Union. And I think a lot of these people come from like the middle class, kind of comparable to the United States, who kind of like have this kind of like cold, rigid, hierarchical, boring uh, lifestyle set up for them like from birth, and they're totally radically uninterested in participating in it. I'm not sure how big that movement is, but I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe that one of Stalin's grandchildren lives this kind of like sort of like dropout hippie lifestyle in the Soviet bloc. Not sure. I don't think this. Also, I think this kind of like I don't think this like never mind. I was gonna say I don't think this like hippie bloc is particularly like antagonistic to like socialism as like a system, or like not socialism, but like whatever you want to call the status quo in the Soviet Union. I don't think they're particularly politicized. Except in kind of like a vague attitude, like on an attitudinal level, I guess. So, anyway, such a state clearly is to be expected to be most unstable, transitory, torn by crisis, and this is just what we find. It is theoretically to be expected to be in irreconcilable conflict with its own, quote, economic foundations, end quote. The conflict would not be irreconcilable if it were in truth a worker state, any kind of worker state, and this is certainly the case. It must go, or the economic foundation must go, and this must happen precisely because it is not a worker state, but nevertheless has the economic foundation for a worker state. Only such an explanation, whether or not put in just these terms, can provide us with a means for answering, without confusion or contradiction, all of the major problems, both theoretical and practical, which the Soviet Union in the present stage of its development poses to the revolutionary movement. And in addition, only such an approach can provide a proper basis for all of our specific policies, which in my opinion cannot be justified any longer on the basis of the committee majority position. Quote, a question of terminology, end quote. It is doubtful whether any dispute which enters into the life of a political organization can ever retain a, quote, purely scientific, end quote, character. At the Council of Nicaea, the debate revolved, it looks like it's supposed to be, it says resolved, but I think it's revolved. At the Council of Nicaea, the debate revolved apparently around a single letter in the word used to describe the Son of God. But the historically specific issue veiled by the words of the debate was the split between the Eastern and Western Church. We are also, in part at least, disputing over what kind of party we wish to form, and how we think it can be best built in the period ahead. The debate over the, quote, Russian question, end quote, in part opposes or tends to oppose conflicting tendencies within our organization. From a scientific point of view, the question of whether or not the Soviet Union is a worker state is to a considerable degree a, quote, terminological question, end quote. The question, namely, of what words are most suitable and useful in describing and communicating what we mean. This does not mean that even from a purely scientific point of view the question is trivial. Words are social in their functioning. It is necessary not merely that our ideas be correct in our own heads, but that we succeed in communicating our ideas to others. The words we use make possible or impossible such communication. But the words are not our property, but rather the property of the society in which we live. Words are one of the chief, perhaps the chief, instruments of revolutionary struggle. Therefore, it is well to take them seriously. The verbal habit which leads the committee majority to continue calling the Soviet Union a worker state, and it is nothing more than a verbal habit, has become an obstacle to the progress of our movement. I think Natalia Sedova Trotsky, when she breaks with the Fourth International in I believe, early 1950s. I think might be like 1949. I'm not sure. But she kind of says a similar thing, is that the Fourth International, at the I think the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States might have to break with the Fourth International for legal reasons, because the United States forbid against like affiliation to any international organization, I think during World War II, and then kind of kept it up. So I think the Socialist Workers' Party couldn't formally declare themselves part of the Fourth International. But either way, what I'm saying is that the Fourth International, represented by, for example, this kind of committee majority, people holding on to the degenerated worker state thesis, her main critique is that they're holding on to like he says, verbal habit or a dogma that has a certain presuppositions that are not thoroughly fleshed out, and which because they're operating with impoverished concepts, are leading them in a politically compromised position. This kind of like terminology about whether bureaucratic collectivism or the worker state, the Soviet Union is bureaucratic collectivist, or if the worker state is a degenerated, if the Soviet Union is a degenerated worker state, it has political consequences in terms of what the content of socialism is, and it has political consequences in terms of like political strategy and how political dispositions, and how workers' movement, which paths the workers' movement and the parties that try to strive for influence within the workers' movement ought to take. And this is absolutely true. I mean, if you look at like the bureaucratic collectivist and state capitalist theorists, almost all of them move in a more like democratic or even libertarian dimension than, I would say, orthodox Trotskyism does. Anyway. The verbal habit which leads the committee majority to continue calling the Soviet Union a worker state, and it is nothing more than a verbal habit, has become an obstacle to the progress of our movement. The verbal habit which leads the committee majority to continue calling the Soviet Union a worker state stands in the way of the successful communication of our ideas to the masses. Calling the Soviet Union a worker state begins to enshrine a bureaucratic conception of a road towards socialism, which, if solidified, will be fatal to the revolution. It deifies economy in such a manner as to obscure the dialectical interrelationship between economy and politics, and between both and psychology, intelligence, and moral enthusiasm. To continue calling the Soviet Union a workers' state serves to justify in the minds of Stalinists and semi-Stalinists their slavishness to the bureaucracy, since do not even we tell them that, after all, the economy is, quote, all? It drives independent thinking workers and intellectuals who have broken with Stalinism away from us and towards disillusionment and defeatism. For we offer them an explanation in words which, when interpreted as men normally interpret words, is false. It obscures in the minds of the masses the real goal which we propose to them. That goal, we must remember, is not a, quote, nationalized economy. Ken and others among the committee majority have been telling us rather scornfully, democracy, Exclamation point. Democracy is merely an instrument. How much more fully must we realize and make others realize that nationalized economy is merely an instrument? If not, then Stalin is the better choice. Internal Bulletin of the Socialist Workers' Party, 1937, James Burnham. The next thing to read from this is The Fourth International and the Russian Counter-Revolution by Ivan Kripke. Thanks for listening.